The following PowerPoint presentation is to accompany Personality, Chapter 13, Culture, Religion, and Ethnicity, Processes, and Differences. Each person is embedded in a complex social system: families, friends, neighbors, communities, and societies. We are heavily influenced by our peers. Even as adults, the way we think about ourselves depends on our friends and associates. Each social and occupational grouping influences its members. Cultural effects are the shared behaviors and customs learned from the institutions in society. There are also dramatic differences within each culture that result from the effects of ethnicity and class. Even within the same city, within the same high school, individuals may develop strikingly different reaction patterns as a function of the history of their ethnic group and of their class. Now, this is not to minimize the fact that all are human beings and all are Americans. Rather, it is important to understand that cultural, as well as biological and social influences, profoundly shape personality. It is difficult to see the peculiarities of our culture without an outside perspective. Things that seem natural and normal to us can often only be identified as cultural specific through comparison with other cultures. Ethnocentrism is evaluating others from one's own cultural point of view. Contributions from cultural anthropology. In the early 1900s, as the field of cultural anthropology began to develop, many insightful researchers, such as Margaret Mead, traveled to exotic locales and observed the native customs, families, and societies. Mead found that the difficulties of adolescence are not the same in all cultures. The effects of the biological or hormonal changes can vary dramatically as a function of society's response. Mead found that she could recognize stable individual patterns, even though the actual behaviors had changed as a function of culture. Thus, once you understand the cultural context, individual patterns of behavior become clear. A person comes to situations armed with much knowledge derived from culture. We share many of our reactions with those who live in our culture and subculture. People are shaped by their culture and subcultures, and so, in many ways, are like those in the same culture or subculture, but different from those in other cultures. In short, when we meet people from a different cultural environment, the culturally consistent aspects of their behavior are so salient that we tend to overlook the individual differences in personality. Emic versus etic approaches. The term emic and etic derive from the distinction made in the field of linguistics between language-specific versus universal ways of describing speech sounds. The emic approach is an approach that is culture-specific, focusing on a single culture on its own terms. The etic approach is an approach that is cross-cultural, searching for generalities across cultures. Problems arise when concepts, measures, and methods developed in one culture are carelessly transferred to another culture. Collectivists versus individualistic. More individualistic themes tend to be found in Western cultures, but more collectivist themes in Eastern culture. Individualists emphasize autonomy and independence, whereas collectivists are more interdependent and group-focused. Euro-Americans and Japanese hold different predictions for future life events. Thus, differences in behavior might be badly misjudged if the surrounding cultural milieu were not considered. These collectivist versus individualist cultural differences also impact people's cognitive approaches and general worldviews. For example, when viewing a conflict or competition, those from a collectivist culture might be more interested in the circumstances and more tolerant of ambiguity, while persons from an individualistic culture would want to know who is right and who is the winner. Errors in scientific inference. The case of race. Race as a flawed approach to grouping people. Humans form groups based on many different sorts of criteria. Many groups are based on professed beliefs, such as political or religious beliefs. Other groups are based primarily on cultural habits or customs. An ethnic group is a group whose membership is based primarily on shared cultural habits or customs. However, some large groupings are also based on race. Race is a large grouping based on physical characteristics, such as skin color, eye shape, height, which are often tied to geographical origins. Because physical characteristics are so obvious, we often overgeneralize or overattribute personality characteristics based on them. And it would not be logical to generalize on the basis of a few physical characteristics and assume that these two men would have similar behavior patterns. Yet, this sort of confusion and overgeneralization is common, especially on the basis of skin color. Skin color is just one particular observable manifestation of genes, as are eye color, height, build, eye shape, nose shape, and on and on. As we have seen, such physical attributes are poor substitutes for a more sophisticated biological, social, cognitive, existential, and cultural analyses of individuals. And a focus on skin color leads to needless, controversial political conflict. Should personality psychologists study race? On the one hand, it certainly makes sense to take into account that personality is influenced by the reactions of others, and that others often react to us based on perceived physical characteristics. On the other hand, there is no known scientific advantage in trying to categorize heterogeneous groups, like Americans, into one of several races. Rather, it is more fruitful to study the effects of ethnic identification, history, family, subculture, religion, and social class as they interact with temperament and affect personality. These classifications are more readily definable and less susceptible to scientific and social distortion. Religion. Culture and religious expectations can be contradictory, and people can find themselves in situations where there are two or more sets of rules to follow. If you are a member of a minority religion, you encounter these conflicts more often, since cultural practices tend to be aligned with the majority religion. Religious beliefs and practices can clearly differentiate the reaction patterns of many individuals. Religion can be a key aspect of individual identity. With increases in the interests in religion among college students, and with global strife involving fundamentalist extremists, religion is beginning to assume a more important place in the study of personality. The so-called Protestant work ethic, the idea that the individual should work hard to benefit himself and thereby society, is sometimes invoked to explain the economic prosperity of the United States and Protestant Northern Europe. Protestants tend to be more personal with their religious philosophy and beliefs, including a personal experience with God, whereas American Jews and Catholics are relatively more concerned with social, ritual, and community matters. Still, there is much individual variation within groups. The humanistic existential approach to personality, of course, is very willing to consider spirituality as a core element of being human. Judeo-Christian view of humans as stewards of God's earth is often manifest in individuals who feel they must devote their lives to save the planet, protecting human and animal life, and nurturing families. A non-religious person might be equally committed to such causes, but the underlying motivations and associated behaviors would often be quite different. Buddhism emphasizes core elements of a cognitive approach to personality, because the focus is on the individual's consciousness and its development, rather than on the socialization practices of the environment or relations with other people. There is a focus on individual mindfulness to counter anxiety, which may involve a distancing from the chronic troubles of the world. Socioeconomic influences on personality. First, some terms. SCS gradient is a phenomenon in public health in which the higher a person's socioeconomic status, the lower is that person's risk of getting sick and dying prematurely. Socioeconomic status, or SCS, is a measurement of one's level of education and income. If social class can affect one's likelihood of getting sick and how long one is likely to live, it probably also has significant effects on one's usual patterns of psychological reactions. Karl Marx and alienation. Many societal institutions served mainly to maintain the economic power of the elite. Marx's ideas led to modern socialism and capitalism. The distinction is that socialists believe in a society structured so that people work directly for the benefit of the society rather than for themselves. However, communists believe in the use of revolutions by the working class to eliminate private property, because property is thought to encourage a selfish and dehumanizing society. Marx contended that psychosocial attributes such as alienation could be traced directly to the economic structure of a capitalist society. Fromm believed that capitalist societies must create, by their nature, a culture of consumption. If people are not shaped to crave and constantly consume newer and fancier products, then the capitalist society cannot function. On the other hand, Fromm believed that societies could be created that promoted self-fulfillment through an emphasis on community, love, and mutuality. Language as a cultural influence. Speaking and listening, that is, language in its oral form, are a pervasive mode of interpersonal interactions in all human societies, and a central part of who we are. Particular characteristics of a particular language help shape us toward being a particular type of person. This role of language is a double-edged sword in its effects on social identity, keeping out those who do not proficiently speak a group's defining language, and reinforcing the ties among those who do. Idiolect is each individual's own unique version of his or her native language, a form of self-expression, and thus a part of personality. Dialect is regional variations in phonology, vocabulary, and syntactic forms. When two groups speak related but distinguishable dialects, dialect can be an important aspect of group identity. Within some African American communities, for example, group identity is supported by speaking Black English, and members who talk white are viewed as abandoning their roots. Language allows people to maintain a strong identification with their group. The dialect of a subcultural group, like a street gang, serves many of the same social functions as the technical jargon used within a narrow scientific specialty. Members of the group use words and expressions that are unique to the group and have special meanings within the group. Language can therefore be used both to assert the speaker's membership in the group and to prevent outsiders from understanding communication among members. Language as politics, the English-only movement. The English-only movement in the United States provides striking evidence of the psychological importance that most people attach to the idea of their mother tongue as being part of who they are. Some people favor limiting all governmental communication to English. They believe English language embodies the essence of public life. However, this would mean that immigrants cannot become full participants and contributors to the society. Therefore, the English language movement is a racist, exclusive, bigoted attempt to undermine the cultures of minority language groups. It's a movement intended to take away the rights of non-English speaking people to live their lives and to conduct their public business in their own native languages. Language and thought. The issue of identity is central, with language functioning as an expression of cultural solidarity. But language also functions as an influence on how people communicate and, to some extent, as an expression of their worldview of their culture. What can be easily expressed and what must be included in an utterance varies among languages. Our language influences not only how we say things, but even how we think about and understand and perceive the world. In other words, the specifics of your language not only determine how your thought is transformed into words, but also shape the very nature of the thoughts you can think. Bilingual people behave in line with the language they are speaking at the time, especially if they see their two cultural identities as compatible. If one grows up speaking two languages, as many people do, then certain thoughts and behavior patterns are learned and triggered by a certain linguistic cultural context. Language also influences our social interactions and may perpetuate differences in our understanding of gender. Culture and testing. Like any intellectual endeavor, psychological testing rests on a number of assumptions. To the extent the assumptions are met, the test may yield valuable information. However, when the assumptions are not met, and the tester does not recognize the problem, then the testing can prove not only unhelpful, but harmful. One problem arises when the assumptions underlying the test are culturally biased. Most obviously, the item content of a test may not adequately capture some cultural experiences. Test scores are also known to be affected by such things as motivation, previous test-taking experience, the qualities of the examiner, that is, the test administrator, and socioeconomic status. Culture-free and culture-fair tests. One attempt to deal with such problems was the development of what were called culture-free tests. However, some cultural assumptions creep into every such test. So, researchers turned to trying to develop tests that were culture-fair. Culture-fair tests attempt to control for or rule out effects that result from culture, rather than from individual differences. Another way to approach the issue is to include some subscales that are known to be culturally biased and other subscales that are thought to be more culture fair. Some tests now try explicitly to take culture into account, such as the system of multicultural pluralistic assessment, which assumes that test results cannot be divorced from the culture. The focus of comparison is among individuals within a cultural group rather than between cultural groups. One of the main problems with testing is not that the tests are culturally biased, but rather that they are used inappropriately. What matters is what is done with the conclusion. That is an attempt made to try to change the so-called deficiency. Stereotype threat. Psychologist Claude Steele has shown that people faced with a difficult evaluative challenge, such as an SAT test, may react poorly if they see themselves as identified with a group that is expected to do poorly. Stereotype threat is the threat that others' judgments or one's own actions will negatively stereotype an individual. If, however, these people come to believe that the test or evaluation is not relevant to these characteristics, that the test is not gender relevant or race relevant, for example, then their performance improves. In other words, this theory combines ego, cognitive, and interactionist approaches, in which the individual's identity in a specific situation depends on how she or he construes that challenge and affects behavior in predictable ways. And there are individual differences in susceptibility to stereotype threat. Persons who are especially conscious of their group stigma are especially at risk. Recent work suggests that stereotype threat is a multidimensional concept. Cultural imperialism is the extending of one's own cultural approaches over those of another culture or subculture. For example, in many American history books, the cultures of Native Americans have often been disparaged or ignored. Now, social science, such as personality psychology, is subject to cultural influences and distortions, while at the same time it is held to a standard of scientific methods. A fully valid personality psychology must take into account cultural variations, but must simultaneously construct theories that are verifiable through the collection of data. This is a significant challenge for the future of personality psychology. A more general model of personality and culture. Ideas of personality and predictable behavior are meaningless outside of a framework, that is, a cultural context, in which they are to be understood. Incorporating culture into personality theory. One solution to the problems of cultural ignorance in approaches to personality is not to try to eliminate culture or control for culture, but rather to bring culture into key consideration as a basic element of personality. Everyone grows up in some culture, and culture is certainly part of what it means to be a person. There are no people without cultures. So it makes sense to incorporate culture into personality theories and personality research. Culture and humanity. Some of the most modern approaches to personality and culture focus on roles and cognitive sets. Culture, by influencing what roles we're likely to assume, likewise influences our behavior. Culture helps the growing child determine the ways or dimensions in which to think about the world. Culture helps us to set our goals. With a knowledge of cultural influences on personality, we are more hesitant to accept universal proclamations about, and more willing to look for socio-environmental influences on, the nature of the human being. Modern approaches also understand that historical and socioeconomic influences on personality make it unwise to overgeneralize the concepts that emerge from the dominant or mainstream culture. Now, this does not mean that there cannot be universal theories of personality. It only means that the theories must not ignore these cultural, historical, and socioeconomic factors. Culture and theory. The kinds of personality theories that are developed by a researcher will depend in part on the researcher's culture. Culture influences theory. Now, does this mean that the theories cannot be scientifically valid? Not necessarily. Human behavior is so complex that it is natural that different but overlapping theories will emerge to try to explain it. However, it is helpful to understand each theory in its context and to be open-minded about differing points of view. In closing, be sure to review Culture from the 8 Aspects of Personality discussed during this semester.